All right, students, so we talked a little bit about abolition and trying to get rid of slavery. So we're going to talk a little bit about women's rights and how women tried to get more rights during this period of time. That's what 16.3 is about. Okay, again, I would stress to you that women's rights and abolition overlapped because people were being denied rights that were stated in the Constitution, women and African Americans. And so that's why they overlapped. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker woman, and as you know, Quakers gave women a little bit more equality and rights in their faith. And so when Lucretia Mott realized that that wasn't true for all women in all places, she began to crusade against it. She was crusading against slavery, and then began crusading for women's rights too. And at one of these anti-slavery conventions, she ran into a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's down at the bottom, Mott being up at the top, Cady Stanton down at the bottom. And these women decided, well, maybe we should also be crusading for women's rights, because guess what? We don't have any rights either. So it's time for us to get some rights as well. They put together something called the Seneca Falls Convention. Please, you have to know the Seneca Falls Convention, probably for the STAR test. It was in Seneca Falls, New York. And again, I had a little parentheses here. I would draw your attention to the location of the reform movement. Almost all of these reform movements are taking place in the North. Almost none of them take place in the South. Almost every single one of them. Education reform, literature reform, reforms in art, every single one of them almost take place in the North, not the South. And there's reasons for that, obviously. At this Seneca Falls Convention, it's interesting. There's about 300 people, mostly women, but there's 40 men, so about 10%. Frederick Douglass was one of the people at this convention. And they draw up, I want you to look at the third bullet point, Declaration of Sentiments, and it's modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And in this Declaration of Sentiments, women asked for all sorts of things, equality in all kinds of ways. One of the things they want, though, is suffrage, or the right to vote, because women don't have the right to vote back in those days. In fact, women don't get the right to vote until in the 1900s, so it doesn't come to them for a long time. All right. Elizabeth Cady Stanton told Lucretia Mott that it would be ridiculous for them to ask for the right to vote, that this would be silliness and people would look upon them as foolish. But Frederick Douglass said that they should leave it in that declaration, and so they did. And other important items that were in there would be the right, of course, with the right to vote is going to be the right to speak publicly, the right to hold public office, allow them to hold jobs, and there's discriminatory laws against women as far as a lot of other things I'm going to go into in just a minute. So let's get to that frame. Susan B. Anthony is on money. Okay, there's a Susan B. Anthony dollar, and it is a small little coin about the size of a quarter. And it didn't last very long because it was about the size of a quarter, and it got confused easily with quarters, and so it didn't last very long. But she's also the daughter of a Quaker, and she's calling for equal pay, college training for women, and she organized the Daughters of Temperance, because a lot of these women were also crusading for temperance. You know, they want the stopping of alcohol. And she meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton at one of these temperance meetings, all right? So they all kind of spool up at different meetings. Some of these things overlap. It takes a long time for things to get better for women, just as like it takes a long time for things to get better for African Americans. In 1890, Wyoming was the very first state when it gave women the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920 and the 19th Amendment, and you have to know that. That's why it's in red. You will have to know that. The 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote nationwide. But up to that point in time, women don't have anything. Anytime a woman goes to work and earns money, it belongs to her husband or her father. If a woman would get divorced, she doesn't have any rights to her children. In fact, there is no such thing as a divorce. Remember Rachel Jackson. There's no such thing as a divorce. So it was a difficult time back in those days until things get straightened up. So as I'm just talking about this. During the stage of reform, some states, New York, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wisconsin, Mississippi is a shocker to me, recognize the property rights of women. So again, you can't really own property. Okay, so the second bullet point is kind of important. If a woman owns property, or it becomes hers because, okay, so you're the daughter of someone who owns property, maybe a farm, and the parents die, and there's no one else to leave the farm to, and so you inherit it. If you're married, that property becomes your husband's. It's that simple. And it was brought up in class. Well, could you not get married and you just keep it for yourself? You could, but then if you don't have any children of your own, there's no one to leave it to. So you're sort of in a stuck situation until eventually some of these states, again, the ones listed at the bottom, begin to recognize property rights of women. And again, I'm kind of shocked that Mississippi is in that bunch, but California, not so much. California, I'm not so shocked because if you remember your Texas history, Mexico and Spain before it had recognized property rights of women way ahead of the United States. And even some states eventually allow women to get divorced and get shared guardianship of children. And Indiana being the first state to allow divorce if a woman could prove her husband was an alcoholic, which sounds sort of silly by today's standards. But back in those days, if you could prove your husband was an alcoholic, he's probably being very neglectful in many, many other ways than just drinking alcohol. All right, you need to know some of these people. So job opportunities were very limited back in those days. Elizabeth Blackwell really was the very first woman who became a doctor, and she was allowed to enter medical school as a joke. The men in the medical school said, okay, go ahead and let her enter. She'll never be able to make it, but she did. She graduated top in her class. And after that, of course, once she was able to do it, they had to then start looking at other women and saying, well, I guess if she can do it, other people can too. And so more and more schools had to start allowing women to do things that were before considered just for men. There's a couple other people mentioned in your book that I've got on this frame. Maria Mitchell became a scientist with a telescope and all that. But for your purposes, for our purposes, you need to know Elizabeth Blackwell. And you need to know, and like I said in the first bullet point, even well into the 20th century, I would say into the mid-20th century, even until the 1960s, job opportunities were a secretary, a teacher. Women were not astronauts. Women were not fighter pilots. Women were not presidential candidates. But that is not true anymore. And so within the last 50 years, really the barriers have been taken down in a large way as far as the things that are thought of that women can do and really have been broken and shattered in really almost every direction.